Center's Board of Trustees this afternoon and could not be here for this event, although I think he met the President earlier today. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan research institute that unites the world of ideas and the world of policy and serves as an accurate, impartial source for information. The Center fosters research and dialogue and provides a neutral forum for policymakers, scholars, business leaders, journalists, and the public to examine pressing issues of the day from both historical and policy-relevant perspectives. In doing so, the Center is a living memorial to our 28th President, Woodrow Wilson, a man who was both a scholar and a national leader. Created by an act of Congress 40 years ago this month, the Center is a public-private partnership. In seeking to bring a wide spectrum of people together to discuss critical issues of the day, we have a confident hope that from their dialogue on public policy issues, participants can learn from each other and the work of all can be enriched and better understanding and better policy can emerge. Through some 800 meetings a year and the presence of over 150 scholars during the course of a year, the Center's work and its scholarship commemorates the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. It is a pleasure to welcome President Mogae back to the Wilson Center. President Mogae was president of his country for 10 years, up until 2008, having previously served as vice president, and before that he had decades of public service, including with the IMF, the Bank of Botswana, and as Minister of Finance and Development Planning. President Mogae holds degrees in economics from Oxford University and from the University of Sussex. As President, President Mogae made the fight against poverty, unemployment, and HIV/AIDS the cornerstones of his presidency. Just this March, he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur by French President Nicolas Sarkozy for his, end quote, exemplary leadership, end quote, in making Botswana a model of democracy and good governance. I will make no secret of the fact that the Woodrow Wilson Center very much hopes to have President Mogae, a public policy scholar in residence at the Center, for a period of time in 2009. President Mogae is for us very much in the tradition of Woodrow Wilson. He is a scholar and a policymaker, and he brings together the worlds of ideas and the world of policy. President Mogae, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much for that introduction. I have been asked to share my experiences of the last 10 years as President of Botswana. Since this is an election in your country, and election year next year in 5 of the countries of Southern Africa, maybe I should, by way of introduction, make some comments about the political system, the political and electoral system, in the context of which I was elected as President of Botswana. Botswana is a republic, and with Senegal and Mauritius is one of the oldest multi-party democracy in Africa. The electoral system is that of single constituencies which are won by simple majority. Both the president and the vice president in Botswana are elected by parliament. Presidential and parliamentary elections are simultaneous and take place at the same time as those for local authorities. Presidential candidates are party leaders elected as such at their respective party congresses, not necessarily in the year of the general elections. And if the president dies or resigns or retires, the vice president automatically succeeds or inherits the remaining term of the president during the life of parliament. And so that's how I became president. I was first nominated by my predecessor, and elected by Parliament as vice president. And when he retired, 18 months before the end of the life of Parliament, I automatically succeeded him, since I was kind of preordained by being elected by Parliament as vice president. Well, what did I do? I feel that I consolidated democracy by practicing transparent, accountable governance, respecting the rule of law, human rights and civil liberties, including, of course, women's rights. Consequently, I was able to maintain peace and stability. I will make this general statement and stop, so you can then ask questions on which I will elaborate. During my term, I practiced or continued the practice of sound and stable macroeconomic planning and prudent financial management. We pursued market-oriented policies, and also we felt investor-friendly policies, as a result of which we were able to achieve an average growth rate of 6% during the 10 years of my presidency. That was lower than what had been the case previously. This is attributable partly to the problem of AIDS, of which I'll say something later. Nevertheless, as I say, the economy grew at 6%. As a result, we were able to effect poverty reduction. The number of people living under the poverty datum line reduced from 47% of the population in 1994 to 37% in 2001 to 30% in 2004, and is projected to have fallen to 23% by next year. Per capita gross domestic product grew from $2,900 in 1998, when I became president, to just under 6,000 by last year. Inflation was contained at around 8.3% in spite of increases in petrol prices. And our stock exchange, which was founded in 1995, grew and became a leader among emerging markets, though of course it's a tiny one. A survey of world stock exchanges by Birini placed it number 7 in the world in terms of return to capital. Now, in spite of our investor-friendly policies, one of my chief objectives of diversification of the economy, away from excessive dependence on the mineral sector, especially diamonds, was not achieved. Instead, the incentives we offered to all investors tended to attract more and more investment in the same sector, in mining, so that during my term we were able to open a new gold mine, a new copper-nickel mine, and so on. And there are one copper mine which will be opening this year. Well, I said we followed investor-friendly policies. And for that, both the World Economic Forum and the World Bank have actually consistently placed us first or third or second or third in Africa in terms of economic freedom, quality of institutions. This has also been confirmed by the Economic Commission for Africa, and the World Bank Institute recently confirmed that, and so did the inaugural report of the Imo Ibrahim Foundation. The World Bank's Institute's worldwide governance indicators 1996-2006, that is a report of the World Bank, placed us number 1 in Africa, followed by Mauritius. This measures such broad areas as human rights, accountability, political stability, public service delivery, the regulatory mechanisms, rule of law, control of corruption, etc. Mentioning corruption, that's one of the things we have successfully fought. As confirmed by Transparency International, which has ranked us the least corrupt country in Africa and among the least corrupt in the world. We have established a set of institutions to guard against corruption. We have a Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crime, which not only investigates cases of corruption, but actually conducts lectures and public lectures in radio and television and in schools against the evils of corruption. We, of course, have an ombudsman who deals with cases of the quality of service by the bureaucracy to the rest of the population, to the public. And then, of course, we have other oversight institutions, such as the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament and the Auditor General, both of which institutions are constitutionally entrenched in their independence. So, of course, is the independent judiciary. And this has been part of our success in achieving both macroeconomic and political stability. In terms of political stability, again, the World Bank Institute placed us number 16 out of 212 countries in the world. It is partly as a result of this consistently stable macroeconomic and explicit policies that both Standard & Poor's and Moody's Investor Services have consistently placed us rated as A+, both in terms of external indebtedness and internal indebtedness since 2001. From time to time, we have beaten South Africa, and being a small country next to South Africa, we're very proud of that. That's why I'm quick to mention. We are also assigned a low risk status by AON, insurance brokers. Well, as I have mentioned, it's a number of other institutions, such as the economic freedom, regarding economic freedom by respected bodies like the Global Economic Freedom Network, Freedom House, Carnegie Endowment, the Heritage Foundation, and the Wall Street Journal. I mention this because I think you know about them, so that you had better believe me. One of the things of which I am proud, which I think I achieved, was the empowerment of women. %40 of senior civil servants, permanent secretary level, I think in your structure they would be called undersecretaries, are women. And a number of leading positions in the nation are also held by women. For instance, our Attorney General is a female. Our Director of Public Prosecutions, which is a constitutionally entrenched position, is also a woman. Our Governor of the Central Bank is a woman. And a number of ambassadors are also women. I like teasing you to the fact that, well, we have not yet appointed a chairperson of the Federal Reserve System who is female. Of course, you were able to appoint a woman Secretary of State after us, since we had one already in the 80s. But admittedly, you appointed a women Attorney General before us. It was in the light of this that, for instance, UNESCO, in its report in Gender and Education for All, 2004, by UNESCO, it cited Botswana and Namibia as having achieved statistically perfect gender parity index for male and female enrollment. And this is borne out also by the fact that for the last 3 years, the University of Botswana has graduated more women than men, 3 years in succession, at diploma and degree levels. I was in San Francisco the other day, and I visited Stanford University, and there I found 4 Botswana girls, no male, which was a pleasant surprise for me. Over the weekend, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. There again, the only Botswana student who was doing a PhD there was a woman. I'll admit to failures, though. In spite of my best endeavors, I failed to increase the number of women in Parliament. This is because, unlike in South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, we don't have a list system. Party leaders do not have the power of nominating people who's deciding who stands for Parliament or even council. They have to undergo primary elections. Everybody has to go for primary elections. Now, the surprising thing is that, of course, women are more than men in the country, about 52% to about 48%, which is more or less usual, international. Always 51 point something percent women and 48 point something men. So women are active in political life, and yet they don't elect each other. That I don't know why that is the case. Instead, by the time I retired earlier this year, they are instead agitating for a change in the constitution so that they could be guaranteed constitutionally 50% on grounds that they are more than 50% of the population. And so that is a raging debate. For me, I just threw back at them, no. We are equal. You are even more educated than us. There are more of you at the university. There is no reason why you should, there's nothing stopping you from electing each other, if in fact you are genuine about equality. So those are some of the things that we achieved. I said I would mention something about HIV. So one of the things, of course, which preoccupied me was the fight against HIV and AIDS. We are one of the countries in Southern Africa which are seriously affected by HIV and AIDS. And we reported ourselves to the United Nations in 2000 during the debate on the Millennium Development Goals, in which we explained that we would have no problem attaining the Millennium Development Goals target were it not for the fact that we had a mystery disease as it then appeared to us. But since then, of course, a great deal has happened, and so we have devoted a great deal of thought, activity, and resources to fighting that curse. As a result, as of today, we are providing antiretrovirals to about 95% of those who need them. And we have been able to reduce mother-to-child transmission from an estimated 40% in 2000 to under 4% by last year. Which is very encouraging. However, we are not out of the woods, because we find that there are still new infections occurring, which is what we have undertaken to stop. Our target is no new infections by 2016. And although the rate of infection has reduced dramatically, nevertheless, they are still occurring, and therefore it's still a great worry. To some extent, that is not surprising. With 25% of the adult population living with the virus, that means that there is an overhang of potential infections. We are sometimes compared with Uganda, but then you see Uganda, the virus in Uganda, or the epidemic, peaked before the arrival of antiretrovirals, and therefore if you became infected, you died. And that is why sometimes my friend Museveni claims that he reduced prevalence from about 18% to less than 6%. I think the virus helped him do that. with us, we didn't wait. Unfortunately, the international community was generous. What happened was that we formed a National AIDS Council and a secretariat to that called the National AIDS Coordinating Agency. We created an agency which was directly under my authority as the president. I chaired the National AIDS Council, and when I retired, my successor decided that I should continue to chair the National AIDS Council. And so I'm still deeply involved with that. A great many people were generous to us. Although we are meeting 80% of the total expenditure associated with HIV/AIDS, we have received very generous assistance from your government through the Centers of Disease Control, and we have received a very generous grant through the Centers of Disease Control, this generous grants from PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief. We also dealt with foundations here, the Gates Foundation, one, and MEC Corporation. But also, when we started looking for antiretrovirals, we were the first in the market. Therefore, we were able to negotiate very substantial discounts with many of the major pharmaceutical companies, such as Bristol Myers Squibb, such as Merck Company itself, such as SmithKline Beecham in the UK, Boehringer Ingelheim in Germany, Roche and others. We received discounts of up to 90%, so that up to now we have not even needed to purchase cheaper generics from India, for instance. And although President Clinton has now negotiated very generous discounts also for the rest of the sub-Saharan Africa, those discounts are not as large as ours, because we were pioneers, I suppose. And so we hold a more generous opinion of the world's pharmaceutical companies than perhaps the rest of the world, because they were generous to us in our hour of need. Because of the continuing infections, by the way, what we have done, we have a superstructure. We have the National AIDS Council, which I chair, and under it we have the National AIDS Coordinating Agency, whose membership include the collaborating partners, that is the companies and representatives of governments who help us, civil society, the private sector in the country, then of course the government, including labor unions and so on. And we have established multi-sectoral AIDS committees at the district level and at the village level. We have what are called multi-sectoral district AIDS committees and multi-sectoral village AIDS committees. And again, we have received generous assistance from your government because we had a Peace Corps program from around our independence in 1966 to about 94. And it had been discontinued by mutual agreement. But from the point of view of your government on the ground, that now that we were a middle-income country or so-called upper middle-income country, we could manage on our own. And indeed, we thought we were managing before the scourge of AIDS hit us. But after we realized that we were in serious trouble with HIV/AIDS, I asked President Bush to restore the Peace Corps program, and he agreed. And so the Peace Corps have been operating in Botswana once again for the last 3 years, and they are helping mostly with AIDS. They work as secretaries, as chairpersons, as various activities associated with the administration of HIV and AIDS. The head of our National AIDS Coordinating Agency used to be a doctor, but since 3 years ago, we replaced the doctor with a statistician. So we have detailed figures of the situation by age cohort, by gender, by district, by village. And so that's why we are able to tell that infections are still taking place, even though at a reduced level. We do so because, amongst other things, we established what we call voluntary testing and counseling centers. In other words, people could go to these places and test for AIDS and be counseled. Well, they are counseled first before they are tested. But in 2004, in addition to that, then we introduced voluntary test. We introduced what we call has now come to be called the opt-out routine testing. That means that if one goes to a public health facility and has to be tested for any other disease, then the tests would include one for AIDS unless the person objects, or that is opts out. If you are tested, your blood is taken, then they tell you, okay, we will test everything, including AIDS, if you agree. Then if you agree, yes, they will test for AIDS. But if you don't, then they will not do that. That really took a lot of our effort and has caused us to divert substantial resources away from development projects and programs to curative services. Because before that we had placed emphasis on public health and primary health care. Regarding education in general, as I say, I have mentioned the situation of women, but we spend 25% of our national budget on education alone, and that has been the case for the last 20 years. We guarantee 10 years for every child, and we give scholarships to students for tertiary education, tertiary training. Up until about 6 years ago, everybody received a grant for tertiary training. But now it has been modified somewhat so that if you are doing a science degree such as medicine or engineering, then you receive a free grant for the duration of your study, full funding, tuition and everything. But if you are doing subjects like economics or public administration or political science, then you are only eligible for an interest-free loan. The idea was to try to transform our education, reorient it towards science and technology, and encourage it that way. We try to do that with the salaries of teachers, and try to pay science teachers a little more because they were fewer, but because the non-science teachers are more, they went on strike, so we retreated. I think that's all I want to mention. Let me stop there. Then anything that I left and you want to ask about, I will be able to elaborate a little more fully. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Apologies for Ambassador Wolpe. He had to leave the room for a moment. Return shortly. As is the custom here, we will have microphones made available for questioners. Please wait for the microphone because this is being a webcast so that you can be heard on air. But when you get a question, identify yourself and your institution. So we can start. I see the first hand right up there.
Joe Bell with Hogan and Hartson and also with Revenue Watch. Your country's remarkable success, is very well known, and there are two aspects I'd be curious about. One is the relationship, the well-known relationship with De Beers, and how that relationship has been helpful. I assume it has been helpful in terms of the long-term stability and development. And secondly, quite separately, you mentioned the civil service, and I'm very interested in how you've been able to keep and maintain a first-class civil service, and particularly how you are able to pay them adequately to avoid the temptations of corruption and other problems.
Thank you. Normally we bundle a couple of questions, Mr. President, if
Yes.
that's okay. Okay, let's take one from down here. As those were two questions, we'll answer after Tony's question.
Hi, Tony Carroll, Manchester Trade. Perhaps you could touch upon the issue of indigenous peoples, the San people, and the provision of education to them. I remember your predecessor, President Masiri, coming here in 1996, talking about that issue because it, at that time, was a fairly hot issue politically. But the notion that all Botswana are entitled to these privileges and rights for education, which I thought was a very compelling statement. So I just maybe perhaps just query you a little bit about that situation and reflecting back upon your 10 years.
Okay, I think that gives you enough
Yes.
to start on.
Certainly does. Well, regarding the partnership with De Beers, the background is that De Beers is a diamond-dependent company. It's a diamond company. We are the largest producer of diamonds by value. Not only that, we are excessively dependent on diamonds. And therefore, we had to negotiate with De Beers over the last 40 years. When they started, they were a global operating company controlling 85% of the world's diamonds. They marketed 85% of the world's diamonds. We were a least developed country among the 25 poorest in the world, without capacity. So what we did when they discovered diamonds in Botswana in 1967, exactly 100 years after diamonds were discovered in Kimberley in South Africa, we were anxious that they should start mining, which they were able to do by 1972. What we then did, they said that the mine would be marginal, and it was also true that there was no infrastructure that now exists. I didn't mention that, but so we agreed. We gave them pioneer industry status. That meant that they could recover the capital invested on an accelerated basis. They had estimated that they would be able to do that in 7 years. In the event, they did so in 18 months. And therefore, when that happened, we sought assistance from the Ford Foundation, from the Canadian government, from the Commonwealth Development Corporation, and from others to hire experts to renegotiate. There were a couple of people who were working in the World Bank. We induced them to take leave of absence, and we hired them through Ford Foundation assistance or to negotiate. The negotiations, which were somewhat acrimonious, lasted 2 years. But at the end of the negotiations, there was a partnership. It was agreed that we will take a certain percentage, and we would achieve that by charging a 15% variable royalty. Then we will charge the normal tax. They said it must not be a special tax for them, because they said they feared that there would be a sitting duck. But then we also agreed that we would buy 50% out of the revenues that we would get. We would buy 50%. So that we did. As a result, nevertheless, they were still getting a very dramatically high rate of return on the capital invested. And so once that agreement was reached, and as a result of the bitter, acrimonious negotiations lasting 2 years, there was appreciation of the relative strengths of both sides, and also a recognition that DBS was a diamond-dependent company. We were a diamond-dependent country and economy. And since then it was agreed that we would review the marketing arrangements every 5 years. And their guiding principle was that there must be a single channel marketing. Single channel marketing meant that all Botswana diamonds must be marketed through DBS. So we agreed to that. And they said they had agreed to the fiscal regime because of that condition. In the event, we were getting 80% of gross revenue after expenses, consisting of the 3 components: variable royalty, the applicable tax, and then dividends. Dividends, of course, it's a residual. The tax was applicable, but in order to attain the 80% split, then we varied the royalty, reducing it if the other things meant that the DBS return was lowered, or increasing it for us to get 80%. And so that went on. Of course, DBS is now a changed company. The relative strengths, of course, changed. The more and more money they invested, and the Botswana mines were the most profitable in the world, because all you would do is to scrape off the Kalahari sands, which cover the first 18 meters of 2/3 of Botswana before you hit any rock. In this case, you'd be hitting a soft rock called kimberlite, which you blast easily, and then you crush it and harvest diamonds. So the diamond mining in Botswana really is a collecting It's not like other mining. When with gold and copper and anything, you have to take the rock and apply chemicals and do things to extract the mineral from there. But not diamonds. Diamonds, they are there. You just look for them. That's why they do so in the mud fields in Angola and Sierra Leone. We do so in the sand. And so the operating costs were quite low. But as I say, the regulatory framework in the world has changed. In the European Union, for instance, the DBS is no longer allowed to market other people's diamonds other than produce from its own mines, including, for instance, Russian diamonds. The DBS used to market 50% of Soviet Union produce of diamonds and elsewhere. They are no longer allowed to do that. So now they don't longer control 85% of global production. They only control about 60, consisting of their mines in Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. And a little bit from Canada, where they have minor shareholding. But we also, of course, wanted them to trade. And we are glad that now DBS has about 4 mines, and they are all controlled by Botswana engineers. Production in the hands of Botswana, the managing director, deputy man, they are all Botswana. And the DBS has behaved well. They were the first company to buy antiretrovirals for their employees and their families. And so that's the relationship with the DBS. It has not always been easy. 3 years ago, we were renegotiating, renewing the lease of one of the richest mines after 25 years. And we used the occasion to improve our share a little, and also to force them to agree to stop objecting to the establishment of cutting and polishing in the country. By the way, they also reached an agreement with your government. They paid a $10 million fine, so they are no longer regarded as felons. They can visit here.
That's right.
That's why we have our beautiful young lady from Ghana here saying DBS proudly, because they are no longer indicted. And now we have licensed 60 cutting and polishing houses from here, from the United States, from Israel, from India, from Antwerp, from Britain. And some of them, of course, will also be going on to jewelry manufacturing. Tiffany's are involved with one of the mining companies there. So it's LKI, a New York firm. So I think that's the relationship with DBS. It's a partnership based on mutual interest, where the shuffling is always about increasing one's share, but always bearing in mind not to do anything that would have the effect of disrupting the global diamond market, including in this country, which accounts for 50% of global consumption of diamonds, followed by Japan at 20%, and Western Europe at another 20%, and the rest of the world, the balance. The civil service, well, what happened was that we maintained the apolitical colonial service as it was in its structure. And we had a public service commission so that people were appointed on merit by this agency. We only changed it later to create a directorate of public service. But then the public service procedures were established. There is a Bible of civil servants in the colonial service called General Orders. We maintain that, we still have it, although now in addition we have the Public Service Act. So that civil servants acting in accordance with the law are protected, even though they have to take instructions from their bosses. So they can only be punished for refusing to take a lawful order. And therefore the traditions of the civil service were maintained, and we, of course, the donors were very generous to us in the early days. They did a lot of training for us. I have mentioned that you had Peace Corps, we had Danish volunteers, we had Swedish volunteers, we have British, not quite volunteers, but they were provided by a non-governmental organization. They were called ODI Fellows, Odins, and they normally were, the British audience were recruited only from Oxford and Cambridge. So they were first-class youngsters. But of course, like everybody else, all the volunteer groups were very hard-working, very idealistic. And that helped us also maintain a productive civil service. And we trained, we then tried to, in recent decades, we tried to base ourselves on Singapore, but we are failing to equal the standards of Singapore. Still, we aspire to. We send our people to their staff colleges and so on. Now, of course, we send them all over the world, here to, and we tried all other methods, business methods of productivity improvement. So that's as far as the civil service is concerned. Regarding indigenous peoples, they are entitled to everything that everybody else is entitled to. So in fact, there is no problem about that. What was a controversy in the last couple of years was that we grouped the what we were called the Bushmen. We called them remote area dwellers. So normally what you do, you sink a borehole, provide water in the Kalahari. Water is only found underground, and that's where they settle. Then we build a school, we build a clinic, and that's what we do. That's what we are doing with everybody, not only the so-called Bushmen or the San or Baswara, as we call them. But what happened was that during a drought about 10 years ago, we sank a number of boreholes for relief of wildlife. Wildlife were dying, so we sank boreholes for wildlife. Then they came into this, and during the drought we said, well, that's all right. That's also where we would meet them. We provide feeding, free feeding for them during drought periods. So these settlements then became bigger. And in any case, originally they were averse to parting with their children. So what we used to do, we sink a borehole, and then we give them rations. When they come to collect rations, we request them to leave the children behind because it's very hot. They would go and then come back in 2-3 days. Then we built schools for these children. So these settlements then evolved into villages. The Basarwa were eligible, like everybody else, for certain development programs, like livestock. They were entitled to be given donkeys or a horse. They could either have 2 or 3 donkeys or a horse, and they could either have 15 goats or 5 cattle. But for that program, we said, you have to move out of the park. You can't rear goats and cattle inside of the park. They were reluctant, so we induced them. We paid them compensation, we said, for removing them, and we built 3 settlements outside the park, and they could choose to go into one of those. So initially everything went well, but then some other people said no, the Bushmen their land was being taken away. There's no question of anybody's land being. The Kalahari is vast. There is no shortage of land. But it was said no, they have been taken away from the ancestral land, which is a lie. The ancestral land of the Basara or Bushmen is the whole country, not the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. The only thing that is attractive about Central Kalahari Game Reserve is that their game is more plentiful because it's a park. And now, also, they went to court and won the right to carry guns. We said, yes, you can carry guns, you can hunt with guns, but not in the park. But they were beginning to hunt in guns. They were chasing animals on horseback. That's also not allowed. And we thought the solution was, of course, they settle outside the park and hunt in the periphery of the park, but not inside. But a British NGO disagreed and started agitating and writing all sorts of untrue stories about us, and they, in the internet and in all newspapers all over the world. For the first 2 years we were not aware until our attention was drawn by other people. So we then began trying to counter that, but they continued. We asked them, why are you doing this? They said, no, you must leave the Bushmen alone, and we'll continue to do this unless you allow the Bushmen to stay and hunt in the park. So that is the controversy that surrounded the Basara or Bushmen. And so it continued. First they said we had bribed them because they demonstrated that we paid them excessively large amounts for almost non-existent dwellings. Then later they changed and said, no, we must have forced them. And then they instituted a court case, which lasted, I think, 4 years. Whenever they ran out of money, they would come into this country and say all sorts of lies. The only way we were able to maintain our humanitarian respectability, we would invite Congress people and senators to visit the area to see for themselves. British MPs, because it was a British NGO, also European MPs from the European Parliament. But the case went on and on and on and on, and the propaganda against us also continued. So, in the end, the case ended. The court said that we had not adequately consulted, otherwise they would not have agreed to come to court so soon after they had been settled. But in fact, they themselves didn't know what was happening. And so we said, yes, those who want to go back can go back into the park, but the laws still apply. You have to leave your cattle and your donkeys outside. What they are now trying to do is to use the park as a hunting ground. They are perfectly happy to live in the new settlements because there is water, there is schooling, there is health, and there is free rations for destitutes, and in their case, almost all of them, and the children. And so they have they stay in the village, but they go into the park to try and hunt. So that remains otherwise they agree about education, children being educated and attending hospital and so on and so on. So that is the position.
Great. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Botswana, I'm going to just ask one question, then I'll turn to the audience again. Just 1 second. Let me just pose my query. Botswana is everywhere understood as a remarkable success story on many fronts, both in terms of fiscal probity, in terms of the what has been done by your own country in dealing with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and then thirdly, in terms of the area of corruption. Years ago, when I was in a research mode over at Brookings, I undertook a case study of the Botswana anti-corruption unit that was established, which was a remarkable story. It's never been received much publicity, but where, as I recall, you actually went out to Hong Kong, hired away the vice chairman of the Hong Kong Anti-Corruption Commission there that had led the effort of cleaning up Hong Kong, which had become a cesspool of crime and corruption, and then brought him over and established this new entity where 11 of the top 12 agency directors were all expatriates initially.
Yes. Which was an
extraordinary testament to Botswana's self-confidence. And the argument was that expatriates more than fellow compatriots would be more in a position to deal directly with the problems.
Without fear or favor.
That's right. And there was a mandate that was given to this commission to investigate any individual whose lifestyle was not commensurate with known sources of income. I think that's almost an exact quote. And I could just imagine what civil libertarians would do with that in this country. But it was an extraordinary undertaking. And what I'd like you to do, if you would, just for a couple of minutes, is sort of update us on that commission and how it's evolved. But secondly, just more generally, the reasons for Botswana's success, and what lessons possibly from the Botswana experience in dealing with corruption might be applicable to other countries struggling with that subject. And let's take a couple more questions here, but I just want to put that on the table. Yeah.
I would like just to thank the President for being here today. And by the way, I'm Bernard with the Woodrow Wilson Africa program. I understand that you have really provided a great leadership to the people in Botswana. So my question to you is, have you ever thought of working with the African Union to provide such a leadership to the African leaders?
Thank you. You may want to say something about your new presidential initiative that you were describing last night. And then right there in the middle. Yeah.
Good afternoon, President Mogae. I'm Jose Manuel Bassat from the World Bank, and I have a question regarding energy. In the wake of the severe power crisis that has affected the Southern African region earlier this year, I think Botswana has started to make greater use of its coal resources to ensure energy security. And while this is, in my view, a very legitimate endeavor to use the main resource that you have to produce energy, one could imagine environmental NGOs and other organizations making some fuss about the increased carbon emissions, especially in the West. And now, I mean, in the context of you also having been appointed recently a special envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Climate Change, I would want to ask you, how do you think that the Botswana government should actually articulate its position regarding the energy security for Botswana and avoid having the environmental equivalent of a Survival International, like a very politicized NGO, just kind of taking the lead and putting a lot of undue pressure on you? Thank you.
Mr. President, I have to absent myself again for just a brief moment. Tony, would you take over the chair here just for a second? I think I have enough questions in front of you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. That's fine.
Thank you. Regarding our success in fighting corruption, why it's very difficult to answer questions why others have not succeeded in a similar fashion. But I would think it's because, first, we were a very poor and rural community at independence. And rural people are normally not very corrupt. And so we then instituted measures against corruption early enough before it became too established. As our population was becoming more sophisticated and more businesses were coming and hundreds of projects developing infrastructure and so on, and therefore opportunities for corruption became existent, we already worried about corruption and what harm it could do, and therefore we established these mechanisms. But as I say, already there were, under the Constitution, oversight agencies in the form of the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament, which investigates how holds public hearings of how public money was spent. Then, of course, there is the report of the Auditor General, which is also published, and the Auditor General is, as is the case elsewhere, constitutionally entrenched individual to investigate any public sector institution, and that is, not only the accounts of the government, but even those of parastatals, in addition to their own private auditors. And then, of course, we have an independent judiciary. But then we took the further step to establish the anti-corruption agency, and we went to Hong Kong because at that time that unit in Hong Kong was kind of famous, so we wanted to get the best, and we did get them, and they came in. They were British. They didn't know the local people, and so they were objective, and therefore we localized. We were training while they were still there, so we then did what we called localization, whereby as their contracts were expiring, they would then be replaced by people who were properly trained. So I think that's why. I think we started early enough. There are certain countries, certain sister republics in Africa, where corruption is so entrenched. I often think that it's sometimes unrealistic of the world to think that any particular president in some of those countries could come and in a period of 5 or 10 years end the corruption. Because the corrupt people are so entrenched and they are clever, and maybe also they are intelligent. Maybe that's why they are corrupt. They know how to cheat everybody else. And so it's going to take time in some of those countries. But I think on the whole, the fact that all our countries are now talking openly about corruption. You know, what used to be the case was that corruption was a worry of the donor agencies, saying, okay, we will give you so much and we want to know what you did with our money and so on. That's no longer the case. I mean, the donors may still be worried about their money, but at least inside individual countries, corruption is also an issue. It's also a topic of debate. It's also a matter of argument between political parties. And therefore, I think the corruption situation is gradually getting under control. I think we are relatively more successful because we started early. That I think is the explanation I can give. But I often also say that there is always an element of luck, in the sense that our very first government was a clean government, and the leadership was committed to clean governance and also committed to democracy, and therefore accepted advice about things like fighting corruption. You know, in small countries like that, when they become independent, individuals tend to matter more than institutions. It's later when you develop properly that institutions become more important than individuals. You know, even in relatively big countries like South Africa, imagine if the first African president was other than Mandela. There was a moment in time where Mandela was more or less even more important than ANC in terms of managing that transition. But of course, in a democracy, in a developed country like South Africa, the situation passes so that it normalizes, whereby institutions and the law matter more than individuals. Have we ever considered working with other African Union members on how we do things? Well, we are a small country. We have neither the capacity nor the inclination to impose our will on anybody else. We can only endeavor to lead by precept and example. In the last 3 years before I retired, it has now become practice for me to be asked to give a talk at the African Union on AIDS and the problem that we face. The first time I tried to do so, they refused flatly for 3 years in succession. And it's only in the last 3 years that they began to agree. It was also in the last 4 or 5 years that they agreed to include economic management in the topics for discussion at the AU. Previously, it was just enough to denounce apartheid South Africa and all imperialists and neo-colonialists, and you pass resolutions and then we go home. But this question of once we started discussing governance, more and more people became interested until we actually passed a resolution to the fact that we will not recognize anybody who has come to power by unconstitutional or illegal means. We would like to believe that gradually and indirectly we made a modest contribution to the orientation of discussions at the AU level. Regarding coal, yes, there is that danger. But of course, for now, the whole of Southern Africa, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, we have a power shortage such that we have what is called load shedding. If you were in Johannesburg or in Gaborone, you would be told that tomorrow you will be without electricity for 12 hours. But some other districts will have. That being the case, we are desperate to do anything to generate electricity. And therefore, we are in the process of trying to develop a 5,000 megawatt coal-fired power station, which will be the only one. And we feel that come Denmark 15 months from now and the subsequent negotiations, that it will not be unreasonable for us to show that in our case it is absolute necessity, that in the modern world it is impossible to live without electricity. That's one. But also that we are actively exploring alternatives such as natural gas contained in the coal seams, so that while we are developing a coal-fired power station, because it's technology that it's known and it's easy, we are also exploring the possibility of extracting methane gas from in situ coal deposits. But apparently it has to take a lot of research and determining how much coal is here. I am told we have to sink about 25 sets of 25 boreholes and flare them for a certain period of time. So we are doing that. We are also interested in solar energy. In fact, we established a small photovoltaic power station for one particular village. We are looking up to more advanced countries like the United States and Germany about advances in solar technology, and we would be glad the day that this solar energy would be more common and therefore cheaper to implement. And so that's how we expect to handle the situation of energy. But of course, you are right, there is no guarantee that some NGO would attack us and so on. But as I say, the situation of energy in our region, the whole region, is desperate. I mean, if electricity goes off, when patients are strapped up in all sorts of sophisticated machines, that's not a viable proposition.
We have time for one more round of questions. Yes.
I'm Ian McNairn with USAID. I have a question about Zimbabwe. Botswana has been very strong in the region after Zimbabwe's March elections in terms of putting pressure on the government to acknowledge those results. Right now we're at an impasse between the MDC and ZANU-PF. I'm sure you've rubbed shoulders with Robert Mugabe many times in the last 10 years. What can be realistically done by Botswana and other SADC countries to acknowledge those election results?
And 2 questions there.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ndimiake Mokalieli. I'm with the Voice of America in Washington. Also very interested in the Zimbabwe question. But in addition to that, Africa is starting to really accumulate a handful of former leaders who have left quite respectably, either by conceding defeat to an opponent or stepping down when it's time. What do you think the role of former leaders should be at such a juncture to, for one, make it more attractive for leaders, say like President Mugabe, to step down and continue a role in another capacity that could equally be beneficial to not only the continent but the world as a whole? Thank you.
Thank you. And Deidre?
Judy Asuni from SAIS.
Judy.
Thank you. Botswana is one of the countries that's been able to handle the resource abundance without it turning into the curse. Could you tell us a bit more about how you actually managed your natural resources in a positive way that didn't lead to the conflict that is so typical of a lot of other countries? Thank you.
Well, actually, let me complete the question about energy and my role. As I understand it, my role as a special envoy of the Secretary General on climate change is to convince my government and other governments in the region and elsewhere of the overriding necessity to do something by everybody to contain emissions, noxious emissions, so that by the time of the meeting in Denmark, there is at least a consensus and a willingness on the part of everybody to make a contribution, however modest, so that in principle, everybody should in principle accept that there is necessity of some action which might involve some inconvenience, and also the need to try safer and cleaner new technologies for generating energy. So I will be talking to governments in that context. Of course, after Denmark, there is going to be detailed negotiations. Now it will be for the time for Western Europe and North America to be haggling with China and India and Latin America and so on about percentages and rates of fraud and targets of reductions and rates of reduction. But the strategy of the Secretary General is to get everybody to agree that yes, there is need to do some such thing, to make an effort and to accelerate the development of alternative energies. Do things such as things that countries like Germany and Austria are doing with wind, for instance, and what you are beginning to do with solar panels here, which we in Southern Africa, especially Botswana and Namibia, would gladly copy, and so on. And we are also glad to hear that the World Bank would be willing to consider lending for projects. Well, what realistically can be done about Zimbabwe? I don't know. Today when we were talking in our meeting, I thought also what a pity that the Woodrow Wilson Institute South Africa program did not go to Zimbabwe before the elections and try to convince the Zimbabweans that they can live together, not just sign an agreement, but actually implement it, and that they would benefit more. They would all benefit, both those who are in power and those who are out of power. They would benefit by peace. At present, I am not so sure whether ZANU-PF shares the hard position taken by President Mugabe. I sometimes also cannot believe that the president is aware of the extent to which the people of his country are suffering. I don't know. Maybe when there are those riots in South Africa and elsewhere, he gets to hear about them. In Botswana, to our embarrassment, we used to have to return 1,000 Zimbabweans every week, or 2,000, 1,000, like that. But of course they would come right back because they were perceived as exacerbating the unemployment situation, exacerbating the crime situation, exacerbating the shortage of housing, and so on. But of course, a great many of them are employed because many of them are skilled people, hard-working people. And they are, many of them, being exploited in all countries in Southern Africa, especially Botswana and South Africa, because they are there illegally and they are paid starvation wages and they have nobody to whom to appeal. Whether President Mugabe is aware of this, I don't know. In Botswana, we try to round them up. We try to arrest and prosecute those who do that, but it's ineffective. In fact, it's futile. You have a situation where sometimes groups will come and surrender themselves to the police because they are hungry. They say, we are illegal immigrants, but we are hungry. Arrest us and feed us. And they would be arrested and be fed, because once they are arrested, then they are required to be fed and to be housed. And then they would play sick if you are told, okay, now you have rested, we are going to deport you after a week. They want to escape again. So really, I don't know what realistically can be done. But something must be done. I think more and more pressure. I think the SADC must speak with one voice to tell the government of Zimbabwe that the people are suffering, that it's time to stop the suffering of the people of Zimbabwe, that the international community would be willing to come to the help of Zimbabwe once they can reconcile and start national reconstruction. Well, you are aware recently we refused to recognize President Mugabe on the grounds that the elections which had just taken place were illegitimate. But of course that didn't help very much. I think if we can all speak with one voice, up until now One person who could have spoken firmly and did not was President Mbeki. In fact, SADC was virtually helpless because we could not agree even on statements whenever something undesirable or dramatically undesirable had happened. Like the time when the government had bulldozed those houses of about 2/3 people. We could not agree on a statement because there was that dichotomy. The next thing was when Mogae had been beaten when he had done nothing. The compromise was that, well, President Mbeki offered to, instead of a condemnatory statement, offered to go and mediate, which was readily agreed to, and then it was requested that the president of Tanzania assist him, but he declined and preferred to do it alone. And so, but I think sooner or later, the people of Zimbabwe, the leadership in Zimbabwe will come to their senses and realize the suffering they are imposing on their own people. Well, the role of former leaders. One would hope that it's situations, that this conflict prevention situations where they could maybe be helpful. Remember now there is a forum called the Africa Forum. It's an association of all retired presidents or all former presidents, those who were not military. I think it is now 39 members, the Africa Forum. And the criterion for membership is that you must have made some contribution to democracy. I'm told that a case in point was the case of the former president of Ghana, Rawlings. You have to apply to be a member of the Africa Forum. And he was turned down initially on the grounds that he had come to power by unconstitutional means. He said yes, but the situation was different, and ultimately I stabilized the country and I stood for election twice, democratic elections twice, and I then retired, and my party was beaten in an open election, and my party vacated office. Therefore, I may have started badly, but I later re-established democracy in Ghana. So that if there have been 4 elections in Ghana, 2 and the initial ones were under me. And it was thought of, okay, on that basis he should be admitted on the grounds that we are recruiting everybody to support democracy, including those who may not initially have been very convinced of it. I think that maybe gradually, slowly, they will begin to have an impact in their former countries and in other countries. For instance, while I say that really as Botswana, we are too little to have much of an impact, but when we formed SADC in 1980, Botswana was the single solitary multi-party state democracy. There were other democracies like Tanzania, but they were one-party democracies. Now, all the countries of SADC are multi-party, including the Thabo the DRC, including Angola, well, including Zimbabwe even. that's somewhat advanced. And everybody feels obliged to go to elections every 5 years. So we have had elections in Angola, we have had elections in DRC, we have had elections in Zimbabwe. That is why we can talk about whether the elections were free and fair. That's an advance from a situation where there were no elections at all. And therefore, I think the situation is improving. Next year, there will be 5 elections in Southern Africa, in Botswana, in Namibia, in South Africa, in Mozambique, and think in Malawi. And those will be observed by the international community, open to the press, and they are all credible elections. So I hope the situation is slowly changing for the better. Admittedly, the conflict situations overshadow everything else that happens in Africa that could be positive. Regarding management of natural resources, again, I would say that maybe because we were very, very poor, and we perhaps involved the international community from the very beginning, and made a decision as a nation that we will use the natural resources, the financial resources we will derive from mining to develop our people by, for instance, providing free education, which, as I say, education and training has been a priority, remains a priority, followed, of course, by physical infrastructure and health. And so we also had transparent arrangement. It was agreed that mineral revenues should be used only for capital projects, for development projects, because that is asset conversion. You take the mineral resources, you develop some other asset that when the wasting assets are gone, you can point to that asset that it's there. And therefore, there was no room for hanky-panky when we have this formally agreed with GBS with the participation of international experts, and also which was then laid before Parliament, so that what was agreed with the DBS was endorsed in Parliament, and also the utilization of the resources was then also enacted, controlled by statute, whereby mineral resources would be used only for development programs, the only exceptions being education and health, because it was felt that education, even recurrent expenditure on education and health, is part of development. I think that perhaps explains why maybe the resource case was avoided, and therefore it was after the initial negotiations with GBS that took 2 years that the minerals, the Mines and Minerals Act was passed, laying down the procedure for application for exploration licenses, mining licenses, the stages and the procedures that had to be followed, taking into account, of course, the need to attract investors. And so now, when people apply for or make inquiries about mineral exploration in Botswana, we simply throw at them the Mines and Minerals Act and the regulations therein, so they can read for themselves and know the procedure to follow, that they don't have to beg or bribe any official. It's there in the Act.
Okay.
Thank you.
This has been, for me, a fascinating session. I Botswana really is a remarkable story. I think you have a sense, having heard the President address questions in a stunningly comprehensive and incisive way, the kind of talent that lies behind Botswana's success. I'm enormously appreciative of you, Mr. President, for spending this kind of time with us today, for joining the Advisory Council of our Africa program. And as maybe I think was indicated publicly perhaps earlier, we look forward to having President Mogae as a fellow at the Wilson Center later in the next year. So thank you to all of you for joining in this conversation today. And again, Mr. President, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.